Well, now I'll tell you. This is quite the story, isn't it? Pull up a chair, darling, and let me walk you through it. You see, Margaret wasn't just any grandmother. She was a woman who had spent 35 years navigating the labyrinth of the legal system. She had seen the very best and the very worst of humanity, usually from behind a heavy oak desk or a witness stand. She'd spent 3 decades as a prosecutor, then a judge, and finally a consultant for the state police. She knew every loophole, every dark corner of the law, and every trick a criminal might use to slide through the cracks. But she never once thought those cracks would swallow her own family. It was a Tuesday night, right around 2 o'clock in the morning, when the silence of her farmhouse was shattered. You know that kind of phone call? The one that makes your heart drop into your stomach before you even pick up the receiver? That was this call. When she heard Emma's voice, small and trembling, coming from the other end of a crackling line at the county precinct, Margaret didn't panic. She didn't cry. She just felt a cold, hard iron settle into her bones. Emma, her sweet 16-year-old granddaughter, who wouldn't hurt a fly, was being processed for aggravated assault. Margaret didn't even stop to put on proper shoes. She threw her old trench coat over her nightgown, grabbed her leather briefcase, the one with the gold-embossed seal of the state bar, and drove 20 miles over the speed limit until she hit the gravel parking lot of the station. When she walked through those double doors, the fluorescent lights hummed like a swarm of angry bees. A young officer, maybe 22 years old, with a badge that looked too shiny for his own good, tried to tell her she had to wait. Well, Margaret just looked at him over the top of her spectacles. She told him that she was Margaret Thorne, and if he didn't have his supervisor out here in 30 seconds, she would personally see to it that his career in law enforcement ended before his first paycheck cleared. She didn't raise her voice, but she had that way of speaking that made the air in the room feel heavy. She knew the penal code like the back of her hand. She reminded that young man about the specific rights of a minor, the requirements for legal counsel during questioning, and the fact that the girl's mother, the legal guardian, hadn't been properly notified. When she finally saw Emma in that bleak little room, the girl's face was bruised and her shirt was torn. Emma told her through choked-back sobs that Derek had come home in a rage. He had started screaming at Rebecca, Margaret's daughter, and when Emma tried to step between them, he'd shoved her so hard she hit the kitchen counter. Emma had grabbed a heavy glass vase just to keep him back, and in the struggle, he'd gotten a cut on his arm. Derek, that slick, manipulative snake, had called the police himself. He'd played the victim, showing the officers his bleeding arm while hiding the bruises on the girl's ribs. He'd painted Emma as a troubled, violent teenager out of control. Margaret didn't just get Emma out of there. She practically dismantled the arresting officer's report right there in the lobby. She pointed out the inconsistencies, the lack of a proper physical exam for the minor, and the blatant disregard for mandatory reporting laws regarding domestic disturbances. By 4 o'clock in the morning, Emma was in the passenger seat of Margaret's car, wrapped in a wool blanket, safe but shattered. But the real work was just beginning. Margaret knew that as long as Rebecca was in that house with Derek, nobody was safe. Rebecca was a gentle soul, the kind of woman who always looked for the good in people, and Derek had used that kindness like a weapon. He'd spent 3 years slowly isolating her, whispering in her ear that her mother was overbearing, that her friends were jealous, and that he was the only one who truly loved her. It's a slow poison, darling, the way those men work. They don't start with a fist. They start with a comment about your dress, or a sigh when you spend too much time on the phone. By the time the violence starts, you're already convinced you're the one at fault. Margaret called in the big guns. She reached out to her old partner from the department, Captain Webb. Webb was a man who looked like he was carved out of an old cedar stump, weathered, sturdy, and impossible to move. Then she contacted Sarah. Now, Sarah was a private investigator Margaret had hired dozens of times over the years for the hardest cases. Sarah didn't look like much, just a quiet woman in her 50s with a sensible haircut and a sensible car. But she could find a needle in a haystack and then tell you exactly which sheep the needle came from. They met at a 24-hour diner at dawn, the smell of burnt coffee and diesel fuel in the air. Margaret laid it all out. She didn't want a legal battle that would drag on for months. She wanted an extraction. She knew Derek was a coward at heart, the kind of man who only felt big when he was making someone else feel small. While Emma slept fitfully in Margaret's guest room, Sarah went to work. Within 48 hours, she had uncovered the first big secret. Derek wasn't Derek at all. Well, he was, but he had changed his last name 3 times in 10 years. He'd been Derek Miller, Derek Vance, and now Derek Thorne. He'd even taken Rebecca's name to hide his tracks. Sarah found 3 different restraining orders in 3 different states. The man was a professional. He would find a vulnerable woman with a bit of money or a stable home, move in, tear her life apart, and then vanish before the law could catch up to him. The extraction was a military-grade operation. Margaret waited until Derek went to work at the real estate firm, where he'd charmed his way into a mid-level position. Captain Webb parked his unmarked car at the end of the block, just in case things got hairy. Margaret and Sarah pulled up to the house in a nondescript moving van they'd rented for the day. When Rebecca opened the door, she looked like a ghost of herself. She was pale, her eyes were darting everywhere, and she kept checking the clock. She told Margaret she couldn't leave, that Derek would be so angry, that it was her fault for not being a better wife. Margaret just took her daughter's hands, those hands that used to play the piano so beautifully, and looked her right in the eye. She told her, "Rebecca, the man you're living with is a ghost. He doesn't exist. He's a list of court filings and broken promises. And today, we're closing the book." They moved fast. They didn't take everything, just the things that mattered. The photos, the clothes, the little trinkets Emma loved. Sarah kept a watch on the street while Margaret helped Rebecca pack. They were in and out in less than 40 minutes. By the time Derek came home to an empty house, Rebecca and Emma were already miles away, tucked inside Margaret's farmhouse, which had been transformed into a literal fortress. Margaret hadn't spent her life in the justice system for nothing. She had security cameras installed at every angle, reinforced locks on every door, and a perimeter fence that was wired to an alarm system that would alert the sheriff's office the second it was touched. She also had Captain Webb's guys doing extra patrols through the neighborhood. But more than that, she had the truth. She got the Federal Bureau of Investigation involved through Agent Chen, a woman Margaret had mentored years ago. Once Sarah provided the proof that Derek had been crossing state lines to commit fraud and evade legal judgments, it became a federal matter. They started building a case that was airtight: tax evasion, identity theft, and a trail of victims that stretched from Georgia to Oregon. But Derek wasn't going to go quietly. He was a man who thrived on control, and losing his family made him snap. He started with the phone calls, hundreds of them, from dozens of different numbers. He'd leave these long, rambling messages, alternating between sobbing apologies and screaming threats. Margaret saved every single one of them. Each recording was another brick in the wall they were building around him. One night, the fortress was tested. A heavy brick came crashing through the front window, glass shattering all over the hardwood floor. Tied to the brick was a note written in jagged, angry letters. You can't keep what belongs to me." Rebecca was shaking, and Emma was tucked into a corner, crying. But Margaret just picked up the brick, walked to the phone, and called Agent Chen. She said, "He's escalating. It's time." The harassment didn't stop at the brick. Derek started showing up at the edge of the property, just standing there in the dark, his silhouette visible, under the moonlight. He'd send pictures of the house to Rebecca's email, photos taken from the woods. He was trying to show them that no matter how many locks they had, he was still there, lurking in the shadows. He wanted them to live in fear. He wanted them to feel like prisoners in their own sanctuary. But Margaret was playing a much longer game. She knew that every time he stepped onto her property, every time he sent a message, he was violating the federal protective orders they'd quietly put in place. She was baiting a trap, and Derek, blinded by his own ego, was walking right into it. The final week was the hardest. Sarah had tracked down 3 of Derek's previous victims. These women were terrified. They had spent years looking over their shoulders, convinced he would find them again. But Margaret talked to them, one by one. She told them they weren't alone anymore. She told them she had the power to end his reign of terror, but she needed their voices. And one by one, those brave women stood up. They signed affidavits. They provided old photos of their injuries, and they gave Agent Chen the ammunition she needed to pull the trigger on a federal warrant. The night of the final showdown was a humid, heavy evening. You could feel the storm brewing in the air. Derek arrived around 10 o'clock. He didn't hide in the woods this time. He drove his car right up the driveway, his headlights cutting through the dark like 2 angry eyes. He sat out there for a long time, just idling the engine. Inside the house, Margaret had Rebecca and Emma in the reinforced basement, a room she'd built years ago as a storm cellar, now turned into a safe room. Margaret stayed upstairs. She sat in her rocking chair in the living room, a glass of iced tea on the table beside her, and her old service revolver within arm's reach. She wasn't going to use it unless she had to, but she was a woman who believed in being prepared. The phone rang. It was Derek. His voice was different this time. It wasn't angry. It was cold. He told her he was done playing games. He told her he had a gallon of gasoline in the back seat and a trunk full of surprises. He said if he couldn't have his wife and daughter, then Margaret was going to watch everything she worked for burn to the ground. Margaret didn't flinch. She kept him on the line, just like she'd practiced with Agent Chen. She asked him why. She asked him what he hoped to gain. And Derek, thinking he was the smartest person in the room, began to brag. He talked about how easy it was to trick women like Rebecca. He talked about how much he enjoyed the look in their eyes when they realized they couldn't leave. He admitted to everything, the fraud, the violence, the stalking. He thought he was untouchable. He didn't know that Agent Chen and a dozen tactical officers were already closing the circle around the property. "I'm a king, Margaret," he'd said, "and you're just a tired old lady playing at being a judge." Margaret took a slow sip of her tea. She looked out the window and saw the first flicker of red and blue lights far down the road. She said, "Derek, you're not a king. You're a footnote. And I'm not just a tired old lady. I'm the person who's going to make sure the world forgets you ever existed." When the police cruisers swarmed the driveway, Derek didn't surrender. He realized he'd been played, and that tiny, fragile ego of his just broke into 1,000 pieces. He'd always told his victims that he was the master of his own destiny. In his twisted mind, he decided that if he was going down, he was going to do it on his own terms. He climbed back into his car, locked the doors, and before the officers could even reach the window, there was a deafening roar. He had rigged the vehicle with an explosive device, something he'd probably put together in a garage somewhere, fueled by his own desperation and hatred. The explosion lit up the night sky, a terrifying orange bloom that shook the very foundations of the farmhouse. The fire burned for hours. The firefighters worked through the night, but there was nothing left of the car or the man inside it. When the sun finally began to peek over the horizon, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and wet ash. Margaret went down to the basement and opened the heavy door. Rebecca and Emma were huddled together on a small sofa. When they saw Margaret's face, streaked with soot, but eyes clear and steady, they knew. They knew the monster was gone. The weeks that followed were quiet, but it wasn't a heavy silence. It was the kind of silence you feel in the woods after a long winter, right before the first birds of spring start to sing. Rebecca spent a lot of time in the garden, digging her hands into the cool earth, planting flowers that would bloom long after the tragedy was a memory. Emma went back to school, her head held high. She joined the debate team, using that same sharp mind her grandmother had to stand up for what she believed in. But Margaret wasn't finished. She looked at her big, sturdy farmhouse with its reinforced walls and its high fences, and she realized she couldn't just live there alone. She remembered the voices of those other women, the ones who had been too afraid to speak until she called them. She realized that there were thousands of Rebeccas and Emmas out there, trapped in houses with monsters, with no Margaret to come to their rescue. So she turned the fortress into a sanctuary. She called it the House of Grace. She used her retirement savings and her legal connections to create a non-profit organization. She turned the upstairs bedrooms into suites for women and children in transition. She turned the old barn into a training center where women could learn about their legal rights, financial independence, and self-defense. Captain Webb became the head of security, volunteering his time to teach the residents how to stay safe. Sarah, the private investigator, became the director of intake, using her skills to help women track down their own missing documents and build their own cases against their abusers. And Rebecca? Rebecca became the heart of the place. She used her experience to lead support groups, showing other women that there is life after the darkness. Margaret herself spent her days in the study, the same room where she'd planned the extraction. But now, the room was filled with law books and stacks of pro bono cases. She became a thorn in the side of every crooked lawyer and negligent officer in the county. She lobbied for new legislation to protect victims of stalking and identity theft. She didn't just uphold the law, she changed it. Justice isn't always a gavel hitting a block in a silent courtroom, darling. Sometimes justice is a woman finally sleeping through the night without locking her bedroom door. Sometimes it's a 16-year-old girl realizing she's not defined by the bruises someone else gave her. And sometimes justice is a grandmother sitting on her porch at sunset, watching a new group of women walk through her gate, knowing that inside those walls, the monsters can't reach them. The House of Grace grew over the years. They added a playground for the children and a library filled with books about heroes and explorers. Margaret lived to see the first woman they helped graduate from law school. She lived to see Emma walk across the stage at her college graduation, wearing a gold tassel and a smile that could light up a room. And every year, on the anniversary of that terrible night, Margaret, Rebecca, and Emma would gather on the porch. They wouldn't talk about Derek. They wouldn't talk about the fire or the brick or the fear. They would just sit together, 3 generations of women who had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. They would watch the fireflies dance over the fields, and they would talk about the future. Because that's the real secret, honey. The monsters might be loud, and they might be scary, and they might even be able to break a window or two. But they can't win as long as there are people like Margaret Thorne in the world. As long as there's someone willing to stand in the gap, to quote the law, and to hold the line, the light will always find its way back in. So, when you think about justice, don't think about the punishment. Think about the peace that comes after. Think about the way Margaret's home turned from a crime scene into a sanctuary. It's a reminder that we all have a little bit of steel in our backbones, if we're just brave enough to find it. Now, before I send you off to the next story, I want to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from today? And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it really does help us keep bringing you more tales like this one. All right, off you go. I'll be here, waiting for your comments.